Welcome to Kodsnack. I'm Fredrik, and in this episode, recorded at the Øredev conference of 2018, I talked to Woody Zuill, writer of the book on mob programming, facilitator of happy teams, and thoughtful teller of stories. Woody also presented at the conference, and the link to that and everything else we talk about is in the show notes. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Øredev stage.
Yeah, thank you, Fredrik.
Who are you?
So my name's Woody Zuill, and I think of myself as a software developer, even though for the past 3 or 4 years I've not been doing as much of that.
No.
But I've been programming computers for about 35 years. I got a late start in life.
Yeah.
But over the last 15 years I've been very focused on trying to make a better work environment, make it easier for us to excel in our work and to love our lives in our workplace.
Yeah, that's a noble goal.
Yeah, it just helps me keep sane.
Yeah. So I think you're most famous for mob programming or being associated with mob programming?
I think so. Mob programming and no estimates are my probably most popular topics, although prior to that, most of my talks and presentations I would do were either be on test-driven development or just different coding techniques and things like that. But starting in 2012, about there, I started speaking at conferences about mob programming.
So how did you discover that?
Mob programming just sort of evolved out of the efforts of a team attempting to learn how to work well together.
Yeah.
And what we had was a team that wasn't doing so well, and I'd been asked to come in and work with them as their manager. And rather than manage them, I don't believe that we can manage people or should even try to manage people. We should give them the opportunity to manage themselves.
Yeah.
And so when they brought me in, that's basically what I did. I told the team I'm here to help them in any way, and let's figure out how to become a stellar team. And basically what happened was, over a 5 or 6 month period, we were studying together, we were working together, learning to get along well together. And one day, we had to work on a project that was a big problem for one of the developers, but we had put it on hold for a while so that we could do some other things. And as they looked at it, they came to me and they said, hey, this code is a big problem. Let's get the whole team together to look at it with me, and we'll decide who needs to work on it and who should do what. And we gathered together in a room to do that. But a funny thing happened as we started looking at the code. Instead of just talking about it and trying to decide who's going to work on it, we just started working on it.
Yeah.
At the end of a couple hours, it was going quite well, and somebody came into the room, because it was a regular conference room, you have to schedule them, and somebody came in and said, we're scheduled in here next, so you have to leave. And rather than just go back to our desks, somebody said, why don't we just find another empty room somewhere? And at the company we're at, Hunter Industries, they have 8 or 10 buildings or more and lots of little meeting rooms everywhere. We found an empty room, and we went over there and kept working. And after lunch, we went ahead and booked some rooms for after lunch. And at the end of the day, we talked with each other and decided to do it again the next day.
Yeah.
So essentially, we started working together on something. And at the end of the day, we noticed this. We got a lot done. It was of very high quality. We were all learning a lot, and we were enjoying it. We were having fun. So any one of those would be a reason to keep doing it.
Fair enough.
But the team itself said, yeah, let's do it the next day. And after about a week of saying, well, let's do it the next day, we started changing into that being our typical way of working. And that was in 2011.
Yeah.
So that's about this time of year, 7 years ago. So that's pretty amazing to me.
Yeah, that's true.
And it was just purely by accident. There was nothing about it where we set out to say, let's sit and work together all the day, every day.
Yeah.
Now, to be able to do that, you have to have some techniques to use, and you have to understand some principles. Our primary guideline comes from a friend of mine named Llewellyn Falco. You should get him to speak here at Øredev sometime. He's really a great speaker. He came in to give us some training.
After you've been doing this for a while?
Yeah, well, actually, before we were doing this, let's start there. I had been doing some pair programming with him, actually, several years before this time. And there was a directive that he that he had shared with me of the way he does pair programming. And it actually turned out to be really useful for pair programming, and it also works well for working as a group.
Yeah.
The basic idea is that for any concept, any idea to go from somebody's mind into the computer requires that it goes through someone else's hands.
Yeah.
And that means when we're pair programming, if we have an idea, rather than take the keyboard, we hand the keyboard over to the other person. And when we do mob programming, it's basically the same thing. So to keep chaos from it happening, because
that's what we do.
with 5 or 6 people working together, it could be chaos.
Yeah.
We have a very gentle mechanism of a timer. So whoever's at the keyboard will remain there for the length of the timer. We're following the rule that for the idea to go from someone else's head into the computer, it goes through someone else's hands. And we also follow the rule that there's really only one person speaking at any one time.
Now that's a tough one.
Yeah, and that's a tough one.
Yeah.
That's actually really hard to do. And most people spend their day thinking, who are doing programming. And when we're with other people, we continue thinking about what we want to say next rather than what is that person saying to me.
Yeah.
So sitting and thinking at the keyboard alone is something I love to do. I've always loved working alone. So when you work in a group, you have to learn some group techniques or some way to collaborate. So I'm going to say again, in some ways I don't think there's anything easy about this. On the other hand, it's not that hard. It's just you have to pay attention to a few things.
Yeah.
So there you go. That's mob programming. Mob programming is all the brilliant minds working together on the same thing at the same time, in the same space, and at the same computer.
Yeah.
We're only working on one thing at a time this way. Now, it can be done remotely as well. There's a number of teams now working remotely with everybody gathering together, in a web meeting tool like Zoom or something, and working on the same thing remotely. Either way.
Yeah. And mixed, I guess, as well.
Yeah, so it can be, you could have one member who's not there and they just dial in, so to speak.
Yeah.
I don't know if we dial anything anymore. Dials are a thing of the past. But, they hook in remotely to the meeting.
Yeah.
Some people will have a separate screen for each remote member. It's tricky to do it remotely. It's something you also need to practice. You have to understand the difficulties. The person who's not there, if it's just one, often will get left out of things if you're not careful.
That's always a difficult one. So I mean, mob programming has been going on for a while now. Do you feel like it's changing a lot, or is it sort of settling into some kind of known form?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we had our way of working, and the basic concept, if done right, it's not going to be 5 or 6 people or whatever watching one person coding.
No.
It's the exact opposite. It's 5 or 6 people programming, and their code is going channeled through a single person.
Yeah.
So that's what I would like to see as sort of the, one appropriate way to do it. Maybe it's the most common pattern that I see. But there are many ways to do this. You don't need to use a timer for one thing. We used a timer to switch the person out at the keyboard, but other teams use other mechanisms. Some teams just they'll switch out the person, the driver, whenever the person at the keyboard doesn't want to be there anymore.
Yeah.
Another way is I saw one team doing this where they would do the old-fashioned pair programming trick of writing a test and then someone else fulfilling it. But instead, for each test we write, that person will take the keyboard, someone else will guide them in writing the test, and then the team will guide them in writing the code. And when that test passes, they refactor, and then they switch the driver. Yeah. So that's more of an event-driven model for switching the person to the keyboard.
Everyone likes event-driven.
Yeah, event-driven. Of course, that's been around a long, long time. In fact, I heard somebody speak when I was really young about event-driven societies. Ooh. And he had been in Africa and working with some folks, and he said they don't go, well, at 2 o'clock we're going to have this meeting, and at 4 o'clock we're going to go do this. Yeah. It's more like, it would be more like when the animals are coming through, we'll go hunting. Yeah. And when it's raining, we're going to be in our home. Yeah. And, it's like they just talked about things more about what's happening and what will we do when that's happening. Yeah. As a matter of fact, he would even say when there were certain times of the year where the people would gather because the fruit in one area, for example, was ripening,
Yeah.
well, that's the time everybody shows up there. They don't know the date.
No.
We won't know the date until it happens.
No.
But there are weather signs that tell us these things.
Yeah,
so they're watching those weather signs. Like if it's warm for 5 or 6 days in a row, then it's likely that the fruit's becoming ripe.
Yeah.
Or if it's been raining for 3 or 4 days, it's not going to be ready yet. It's going to be this combination of things.
Yeah.
Then when it happens,
yeah,
exactly.
And you don't need to formalize it, put it in the calendar. And
That's
make
right.
A process.
Exactly.
Why doesn't it work? It's in the calendar. No.
Yeah, the calendar would never work. And I think that is actually a good model for software development itself.
Yeah.
When we ask somebody, can you be done with this by this time so this team can work on this? We're creating an artificial schedule that's not based on the events of when they're actually done.
No.
It puts artificial pressure on things. And although some people tend to work better when they're under pressure, I don't know that that's really a good way to approach our work.
No, doesn't feel like it. But it's interesting how there are always more good ideas to be had by looking sideways and outward and.
Yes. Oh, that's a good point. So let's talk about that for just a moment.
Yes.
I believe that we need to keep ourselves open to new things.
Yeah.
And we can't keep ourselves open to new things if we're only looking in one perspective. If we're looking in one direction and from our own point of view, it's good to stay open so that really means looking in different directions than we're used to looking in. It's like sometimes I'll do this. I come to a conference and I play a conference session roulette.
Oh, yes.
I'll just pick a session blindly just to see something I wouldn't have picked.
Yeah.
Another thing that I'll do is pick a session by somebody that I know is new.
Yeah.
They haven't spoken before at a conference because that gives me another perspective that I can't get myself. Another one is I think of it as like opening different doors. When I was a kid, if I walked down a hall, I would just, maybe it's just part of the way my nature, but I would try every door as I went past. And if a door was unlocked, I'd open it up and look in, And so you're walking down a hallway like in your school or at a gathering or a church or wherever you are. If they didn't lock the door, I'm going to look in it.
Yeah.
And so
that's great.
Open a new door every chance you get.
Yeah.
So
I
don't
did
know.
that more.
Yeah. It's something. It's a funny thing. If you open the door, there's a good chance somebody will welcome you in.
Yeah.
Metaphorically.
Yeah.
And if you're welcomed in, it's going to expose a whole new set of doors because it's the doors that are available to those people in that space.
Yeah.
And you no longer are trapped by the space you keep yourself in.
Yeah, and then you can tell them that, I used to be over in those spaces. And you have several doors over there. Did you know about them?
So now we're spreading things around, and that comes up to the idea of connections. So I've noticed this in groups. There's always somebody, like you come in and somebody goes, hey, it's Woody. Come over here, meet these people. So there's always someone who gets you connected locally within the group that they're already in. And then there's these people who get you connected to other groups.
Yeah.
So in every group, there's usually somebody who knows other groups. So these you can think of as maybe superconnectors.
Yeah.
So they're connecting at the next level up. I really find that, and that's one of the really wonderful things about these conferences, is you get to take advantage of all these things.
Yeah.
There's going to be connectors of all sorts at all levels. So I'll tell a story about that. The first time I came to Øredev, am I pronouncing that correctly? How do you say Øredev?
Øredev.
Øredev. Give me a break. I don't know how to pronounce
why did
these
they pick the
things.
name, really?
But they brought me here in 2013.
Yeah.
So Jakob, who came up and met us earlier, saw me tweeting about mob programming and no estimates. This would have been in late 2012. He must have seen, because that's when I first started tweeting about both of these topics.
Yeah.
By March of 2013, he sent me a tweet. Would you be willing to come to speak at a conference in Sweden? Mm-hmm. So we connected up in the direct messaging, private messaging part of it, and I sent him my email address. He sent me an invitation. So that was sort of a super connector thing that happens through social media.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing we really want social media for. It's so easy to get cynical about it, but when those things happen, it's worth so much.
So I think what made my stuff a little bit interesting to someone, because he was on the conference program committee.
Oh, yes.
What the things I was sharing, I think became interesting to him simply because they're a bit controversial.
Yeah.
So the topic of mob programming, when we first started realizing that other people were interested, we were just doing it.
Yeah.
It was good for us.
Yeah.
Somewhere in early 2012 maybe, or late 2011, early 2012, somebody came by to give us some training, saw what we were doing, and started telling other people about it. Mm-hmm. So that was one of these connector things going on.
Yeah.
But up to that point, we just thought it was what we were doing. And that somebody else found it interesting was not something we were ready for. We didn't really understand that.
Now what do we do now?
Well, a funny thing happened. People started, as people started hearing about it, they would say, well, that sounds crazy. Mm-hmm. And that can't possibly work. And the funny thing is that it sure seems like it can't. Mm-hmm. So I would respond to them by saying, yeah, it sure seems like it can't work, but oddly, it is working for us.
Something's happening.
If you'd like to come and see what it's about, you're welcome to come visit us. So people started coming to visit us. One of our earliest visitors was from Stockholm. People came to visit us. And here's the thing. Somewhere along the path, I was speaking at a conference in 2012, so less than a year after we started mob programming. I was speaking at a conference in Dallas.
Yeah.
It was the Agile Alliance 2012 in Dallas, Texas. That's in the United States. Texas is in the United States. And somebody came up to me to ask me about mob programming. He said, what's this thing that you're doing with a bunch of people at one computer? And after 5 or 6 people came up, and I tried to explain to them, person after person, I said, well, rather than me spending my whole day trying to explain this over and over, let me put a few slides together, and they have this thing called the Open Jam. The Open Jam, you can arrange to do a session on the moment. You just go in the morning, you find a time slot, and you sign up for it. Yeah. So I said, I'll put together some slides. I'll contact the team back at home and have them send me some pictures. And they actually sent me then a list of the 15 things they like about mob programming, how they like doing it. And we did a talk. So that was the beginning of me speaking about it at conferences. Yeah. That was a very small talk, maybe a half hour plus questions. And there were maybe 20 people at it. Yeah. But it included some rather notable Agile folks, including, I think, George Dinwddie and maybe Ron Jeffries, and definitely, she wrote one of the early books on Agile.
We'll think of her.
We'll think of her later because actually she was one there that later adopted mob programming at her company. So that led to more and more people asking us to speak. Yeah. And that's when I really noticed that not only will people be interested, and therefore we should be prepared to share about it, I also noticed that this might be useful to other people, not just interesting. And that's when it started dawning on me that I better take responsibility for knowing how to share this.
Oh, yeah.
So that...
It's a big thing to take on.
Yeah, so like in the early days of Agile, when I first started reading about Agile stuff, which is before they called it Agile, I was really glad to find people were sharing their ideas about what in those days they were calling lightweight processes for managing software development. That would have been in the late 90s. So now I'm looking back on it over 10 years later and saying, well, I've got something people are interested in. I think it's going to be useful for them. I should be sharing it. Yeah. So I start preparing materials to explain it and talk about it. And so when Jakob invited me to Øredev, he made me very welcome to come, made it very easy for me to do. And then a weird thing happened. So this was, of course, at a different venue than we are now. Yeah. There was a whole lot of people. There were a whole lot of people there from Stockholm. Yeah. And I had already arranged to do one session in Stockholm at a company called Ericsson. They're a little they're a little telecom kind of
a little phone company.
Little phone company. Now they're actually, fundamental in modern technology.
Yeah.
And have been around, 150 years or something.
Something like that.
So since I was already going to Stockholm, I had mentioned it. And during the conference, at least 10 or 15 people came up to ask me to come speak at their companies.
Yeah.
So going to Stockholm after the Øredev led me to becoming closely entwined in the Stockholm Agile scene, which is extremely powerful. I would say out of everywhere I've been, probably per capita, there's more Agile stuff going on, and probably not just Agile, but generally forward-thinking software development, including lean ideas and other of these processes or other ways of thinking, then, per capita than anywhere else in the world. At least it seems. I'd like to be proven wrong maybe, but Stockholm is amazing.
Yeah.
So now I've got dozens of friends that I wouldn't have had if these opportunities had come forward. This just goes back to the idea of opening doors, being willing to accept invitations.
Yeah,
that particular week, I think I talked at 7 different companies, including Betsson, Nordea, Banks. Is that how you say Nordea?
Yeah.
Nordea. Tredera. King.
Yeah. All of the big names.
It was like a lot of places, and I still visit a lot of them. This last week, I was at King again to do a workshop. SVT, I did a workshop.
Yeah, they do.
And iZettle. So Stockholm is just a hotbed of this stuff.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
Yeah, it sounds like you really took it like one natural step at a time.
Yeah, so I think of this idea as purposeful stumbling.
Yeah.
Or stumbling purposefully.
Yeah, that's what we call running.
Yeah. So I don't really know what's going to happen.
No.
So I just take a step in that direction. Yeah. And if it allows for a second step, I'll probably take that second step. Yeah. Constantly paying attention and looking for the good things. It's all about serendipity.
Yeah.
Not saying this is what we planned, so let's do it.
Yeah.
Instead saying, look at what we've discovered.
Yeah, let's see what's there.
Let's see what's there.
Yeah, that's a really sensible way to do it, I think.
Well, it may be sensible, it may not be. So it just depends on what your plan, for your life is. My plan kind of came to me from my father, who was himself. He was what you might nowadays think of as a systems engineer. He designed switching and switching stations for the U.S. version of Ericsson, the phone company there, the Bell system.
Oh, yeah.
He worked for Pacific Bell. And he would say, it doesn't matter what you do for a living as long as you love your work because you're going to do a lot of it.
Yeah.
And so I think my father he gave me good advice. That was stay interested in things. And he did it until the day he died. He was interested in, besides technical stuff, almost everything. He was a do-it-yourself kind of a guy. He could fix the car. He could fix anything in the home. Yeah. If we needed water, he could drill a well. We raised animals. We had a little farm. He didn't care much for slaughtering chickens, but he could do it.
Yeah.
And my mom taught me how to dress them and how to pluck them and dress them.
Oh, yeah.
So they knew how to do all that stuff. It's amazing what people did back in those days.
Yeah. So you're taking a lot of natural gradual steps there. So you must have a pretty good ability to leave the previous stuff behind as well.
That's a good point. So, one thing that I don't know where I heard this from, but it's like the solution to today's problem is tomorrow's problem.
Yeah.
So I stopped looking for solutions to problems.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, I stopped paying attention to problems. This is an interesting sideline to this. It's one of the things that was important to me at Hunter when I went to work there, where we basically originated this idea of mob programming.
Yeah.
This idea is that let's always focus on turning up the good instead of looking for what problem do we need to solve.
Oh, yeah.
So if we look for the good and pay attention to what's good, it's really easy, usually, to get good things even better, and you get a lot more value out of that.
Yeah.
And yet, most places I've worked, I see the opposite. People are they're not really paying attention to what went well. Matter of fact, they're they're diminishing the stuff that went well by spending all their time on trying to solve the big problems that are in front of them.
Yeah, well, the thing we think is the big problem.
That's right.
I mean, I keep focusing on bad stuff. Oh, this code is a mess. Well, it works.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. So when we see a problem, we set out to find a solution. When we see something that's good, there's no solution to find. It's how do we amplify the good?
Yeah.
So, for example, one of the ways we would do this is at the end of every day, we would have what I would call a retrospective.
Yeah.
Similar to a regular retrospective you might have in Agile terms, but we would just be looking for what went well today and how can we turn that up.
Yeah.
So if you do that just 5 or 10 minutes a day, you get the habit of looking for good. As a matter of fact, this I think is a problem a lot of us have.
Oh, yeah.
It's a habit we need to build, and we set it aside and never build the habit because we're always focused on solving problems. We're under pressure to solve a problem. There's a great paper that was written by a couple of professors at MIT, and forgive me, professors, if I'm saying your names wrong, but I believe it's pronounced Sterman and Repenning. Yeah. And these two guys wrote a paper a long time ago, I don't know, 10 or more years ago, called Nobody Ever Gets Credit for Solving Problems That Didn't Happen.
Good one.
We incentivize people for solving the problems that do happen, and we don't incentivize them for not having the problems. So I'll tell a story from my very solid coding days when all I was doing was writing code. And we had a mandate from my manager that we weren't allowed to do test-driven development, which was a pattern that I had already learned to use. Those of you who don't know what test-driven development is, the basic idea is you write a test that will exercise some aspect of the code you're going to be writing before you write the code. Yeah. And this makes you think about how are you going to use that object and what do you want it to do, or use that code and what you want it to do. Well, they wouldn't allow us to do that. So I just went ahead and did it. Yeah. The thing is that by focusing on test-driven development, my work always got done well and quickly. And then I could spend the rest of my time on they were trying to do iterations, helping somebody else's code that wasn't working. So turning up the good on things like test-driven development and pair programming have been fundamental to me. I got off track there, but I tend to do that. I like to let the conversation go where it goes.
Yeah, exactly. That's my.
So drag me back if I ever get too far out of track.
No. And I realized while you were saying that I mean, test-driven development in itself is. My first thought was that isn't this sort of focusing on the bad because the test will be breaking all the time. But on the other hand, it's actually focusing on the good because this is what I wanted to do. It just doesn't do it yet.
Yes. So because the test cannot pass till you write some code, you're going to start with a failing test. Yeah. And the beautiful thing about that is it gives you a frame of mind about how do I want this thing to work. I first learned about this in the early 90s, before test-driven development I was ever made aware of it. Yeah. And maybe somewhere others were doing it. But somebody shared, it was Bruce McKinney in a book that he had written, this idea of coding by intent. So you write a call to an object before you've written the object. You write a call to a method before you've written the method. And that makes you think about, well, what would I need to pass to this thing for it to do its work? Yeah. So that was a technique that was helpful to me, and I started using it even before, test-driven development ever came along. By the time test-driven development came along, I kind of understood that. Now, in those days before that, I would have used what I would have called a test harness. Yeah. I don't know if that's the proper use of that word, but basically what I would do is write an application into which I could copy and paste the code I was working on. Yeah. And it was awkward and it was heavy, but it did the job. Yeah. And so I could copy, because even in those earlier days, I didn't have an easy way to call code in one project from another project. No. That was still being figured out. Yeah. Of course, I wasn't figuring it out. Other, brilliant minds were figuring that stuff out. So that was the way I figured out how to do it. Probably somebody showed that to me. I don't know. I don't think I've invented anything along the way. I just, but I will say this. Yeah. Whatever ideas you have, don't think that they're not good ideas just because nobody else is doing them. In other words, don't think that you can't also discover something that I'm maybe giving this as advice to myself, that just because it's not prevalent. I used to think, boy, I'm working in software development. It's all these brilliant people, and they're writing books, and they're inventing things. And all I got to do is find those things they're doing that fit my thing, and then I'll be good too. But it's not that way. It's that all of these people they realize that I'll discover stuff if I just try it. And so So that's kind of like closing the door on your own ability to innovate or your own powers of thinking. Be open to using your own ideas, try them, and see what happens.
And remember to look back and see that all those little small steps actually add up to larger things. Because it's so easy to feel like, those people who wrote the book.
And they got to it probably the same way.
Exactly.
They just, and now, and there's a trap that we fall in that we need to be really careful about. Hindsight, they say hindsight is 20/20. As we look back, we go, I know why that worked, and I know why I did this. And in reality, we were just stumbling along.
Oh, yes.
And now as we look back, we go, I was pretty smart. In reality, we just allowed we allowed ourselves to follow the path of the good stuff. And that's all. That's what Turn Up the Good is. That's the topic for my talk today, Turn Up the Good. We follow the path that develops in front of us as we allow discovery and as we allow good things to happen.
Have you always had this mindset, or do you feel like you picked it up along the way?
I think it started for me when I was quite young, and probably in my very first job, I got a real good example of this. I was 12 or 13 years old, and if you don't mind telling me this story, how much time do we have?
We have plenty.
So let's see how this goes. So my dad, I was talking to him about, I don't know if it was for Christmas or some gift-giving thing, and he said, well, you can get any present and every present you want. I said, well, how? And he said, get a job. I said, okay, explain this to me. And he said, okay, well, it's easy. What you do is you go find somebody who needs some help, who is willing to pay for it, and do whatever they tell you. And then you'll have a job. So I said, okay. And my mom knew I was looking for a job. She said, down at the nursery, she knew I was really interested in horticulture as a kid. We grow plants and experiment with them and try to find better ways to start the seeds and all that. So that guy's looking for help. So I went down there. And he had help wanted sign on his door. He had a nice plant nursery, and in where I lived at, this would be a big piece of land outside. He grew roses and daylilies and citrus and other things, and he sold plants to the public. So he grew these things and bred them and hybridized them. Anyways, so I went in and I said, hey, you got this job? He said, I'm sorry, I just hired somebody. And so I went home and I told my dad, and I said, hey, Dad, I went to try and get this job, but he just hired someone. So, well, let me tell you a secret about life. He's going to fire them soon. He said, you think that the opportunity's gone now? Just pay attention. So he said, every Saturday, go back and look. So so every Saturday I went back, and then I started watching these guys as they worked. He had actually hired 2 people, and neither of them were very effective. So after 2 or 3 weeks, I went back into this same boss, and I said, hey, do you remember me? And he goes, yeah, he knew my family. It's a small town. He says, yeah, hi. And I said, I know you hired some people, but I think I could do as much work as those 2 people are doing in the same amount of time, and you'd only have to pay 1 person. He said, well, yeah, they're not doing so well, but I hired them. I'm going to give them a chance. My dad said, just keep going back. So I went back the next Saturday, and he said, I'm going to fire those guys and hire you. He said, anybody who wants to work that bad, I want them working for me. I ended up working there 5 or 6 years after that. But I want to get to now the crux of that story. So he hired me, and he brought me in. And he said, and remember, I'm just a 12 or 13-year-old boy. And he says, so your job is very important. You are mostly going to be watering plants with a hose. There's like a wand attachment on the end of the hose, and you're going to water the plants with it. These plants depend on you for their life. If you don't water a plant, you're going to water them every other day. If you don't water it, its roots are contained in a very small container. And it will dry out and it will die. Yeah. Down in Southern California, we have very hot summertime. Plants will die quickly. He says, and even if you don't if you water them too much or water them too little, even if they don't die, it will stress them out and they'll never have a good life because the roots will not develop the way they should. It's important. And he said, you have a second job. And that second job is to pay attention to whatever we're doing here. And if there's a way to do it better, let me know. So that was the beginning of it for me. He basically was saying, turn up the good.
Yeah, it's all in there.
It's all in there. So I actually went out that week. I worked that whole week. He said, at the end of the week, when you come in to get paid, tell me what you think we could do better. We'll pick one thing to work on. So I went in at the end of the week. He says, well, first you get paid. And he showed me how to get paid. You take a slip of paper. You write how many hours you worked. You times that by the amount of money per hour. It was $1.25 in those days. Then you take that slip, you put it in the cash box, and you take out your money. So you pay yourself. So he was saying, look, you better be trustworthy because I just gave you a lot of responsibility for a 12-year-old kid. Now, what was it that he didn't say that out loud. He was extending trust to me. Rather than having to earn his trust, he was giving me his trust. And then he said, so what did you discover? And I think it was, I saw there was some leaky hoses. He said, well, what do you think we should do about it? And I said, well, if we fix the hoses, then we will have less wasted water. In Southern California, water is precious. We'd have less wasted water. So he said, great. Well, how do we do that? He said, well, I already talked to Bill, one of the other workers, and he showed me how to mend the hoses. So I'm going to mend all the hoses. Excellent. This was pretty interesting to me. At the end of that, I worked for him about 5 or 6 years, mostly part-time during the school year and during the summer. And I learned a lot about doing business from him. So at that same time, I was learning to be a musician, and I decided I wanted to try and be a musician. So these things are not related. There's no musician's and job that includes watering plants. So I had to, you're right. So I had to start moving my career into something else, and I did it one little bit at a time. And at the end of 8 or 10 years of trying to do that, I realized I'm never going to make a good living as a musician. And so I started looking for other things. So I was always looking for what's new and interesting that I want to do. So I don't know if it started from that working at the plant nursery, but it seems like that was my first work experience with that. But I've always been interested. I will say this. Libraries, when you were a kid, you go to a library and no matter which aisle you walk down, it's another different world. And I would just go into the library, and I'm talking since I was old enough to go to the library, and just pull books off the shelf and see what was in them. So maybe it was built into me, but it was encouraged by these people I had worked for. And so there you go. That was a long story for that, but it's a gentle way to think about our lives. That new things will be revealed to us if we're open to them. Let's let that happen. It looks like a new session's getting ready to start.
Yeah, I think so. I think we're about out of time. Thank you so much.
Well, we barely got started.
Yeah, exactly. We'll have to do more.
So maybe next time. Next time.
Let's do
it was a pleasure. Thank you very, very much.
So much.
Appreciate it.
Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.